In the beginning, there was no citadel, no towering structure drifting through space, no laws written by geniuses who believed themselves above consequence. There was only the multiverse, endless and unfiltered, stretching outward in every direction at once. Infinity is a difficult thing to live inside. For most beings, infinity is an abstract idea, something theoretical and distant. But for Rick Sanchez, infinity was accessible, reachable, something he could step into as easily as walking through a door. And so he did. Again and again, Rick moved between universes, not as a visitor but as a constant. Everywhere he went, there were variations of the same world, the same families, the same mistakes repeating with minor differences. Some universes were quieter, some louder, some already broken beyond recognition. And in many of them, there was another Rick. At first, these encounters were rare enough to feel novel. Two versions of the same mind crossing paths, exchanging knowledge, comparing inventions, confirming theories that only someone exactly like them could understand. They did not linger. There was no need to. But infinity has a way of collapsing distance. What feels rare eventually becomes inevitable. As portal travel spread, Ricks began to notice each other more often, not just in passing, but in patterns. Clusters of identical intellects converging around similar ideas, similar shortcuts, similar disinterest in the smaller lives orbiting them. The multiverse was infinite, but Rick was not infinitely patient. Chaos was tolerable in small doses. Invention thrived on it, but unchecked chaos, multiplied endlessly, became noise. And noise, even to the smartest mind in existence, grew tiring. Some Ricks began to slow down, to revisit the same places, to remain longer in universes that felt familiar enough to require less effort. And when they stayed, they noticed something unsettling. Even with infinite freedom, many of them were choosing the same paths, the same homes, the same family dynamics, the same emotional avoidance disguised as superiority. Individual genius, repeated endlessly, began to look less like freedom and more like redundancy. Out of this realization came a subtle shift. Ricks started leaving markers, meeting points, shared coordinates outside any single universe, places that existed between realities rather than inside them. Neutral ground, where the laws of any one world held no authority. These early gatherings were informal, unstructured, a few Ricks exchanging resources, information, and technology, a loose network of minds that understood one another without explanation. There was no intention to build something permanent, at least not at first. But permanence has a way of emerging when convenience is repeated often enough. As more Ricks arrived, patterns formed. Agreements were made, boundaries suggested, then enforced. What began as cooperation slowly hardened into expectation. And expectation, in time, became order. The idea of a centralized place, one location where Ricks could exist without the unpredictability of local universes, started to take shape, not as a utopia, but as a solution, a buffer between genius and infinity. The Citadel was not born from ambition. It was born from exhaustion. Building it was easy. The combined intellect of countless Ricks made construction trivial. Whole sections assembled themselves, guided by shared blueprints that required no discussion. Infrastructure grew outward in layers, each designed to support the needs of minds that rarely considered the long-term consequences of their designs. The Citadel did not belong to any universe. It floated in extra-dimensional space anchored nowhere, answerable to nothing beyond itself. That was the point. Inside its walls, reality was predictable. Technology worked the same way every time. Threats were monitored, variables reduced. For Ricks, who had spent lifetimes navigating infinite uncertainty, the stability was comforting. Mortis came later. At first, they were simply present, unavoidable, really. Where there was a Rick, there was often a Morty nearby, following, surviving, adapting. Some Ricks brought their Mortys with them to the Citadel out of habit, others out of practicality. And the Citadel adapted around them. Housing was created, schools, work assignments, not out of care, but out of efficiency. Mortis served a function. They always had. In canon, Mortis were useful as camouflage against detection, their brainwaves canceling out Ricks. But in the Citadel, their role expanded. They became a workforce, a population that could be managed, categorized, and quietly relied upon. This was not cruelty in the traditional sense. It was something colder. Indifference scaled infinitely. As the Citadel grew, so did its systems. A council emerged, composed of Ricks who believed governance was necessary, not for others, but to prevent themselves from interfering with one another. Rules were established, limits defined, certain actions discouraged, others quietly ignored. The multiverse was still infinite, but within the Citadel, infinity had boundaries, and most Ricks accepted them, because the Citadel offered something rare: rest. A place where a Rick did not need to constantly assert dominance over reality, where genius could idle, where the burden of infinite choice was reduced to a manageable routine. But something essential was lost in the process. The Citadel was designed to control chaos, yet it also dulled curiosity. When everything was available, nothing felt urgent. When every outcome existed somewhere, consequences felt optional. Ricks who once thrived on exploration began to repeat themselves. They took roles, jobs, titles. Some became enforcers, some administrators. Some faded into obscurity, indistinguishable from one another. The Citadel promised freedom from the multiverse's noise, but quietly replaced it with something else. Sameness. And somewhere within its endless corridors, beneath layers of routine and regulation, a quiet tension settled in. Not anger, not rebellion, just the faint, persistent sense that something had gone wrong. That tension did not yet have a name. It had not yet found a face. But it was there, waiting. Drifting with the Citadel as it moved silently through the dark between universes, a monument to intelligence trying to escape itself. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, the way dust settles in an abandoned room. The corridors filled first, long, winding passages stretching across impossible geometry, illuminated by artificial light that never changed with time or season. There was no day or night here, only cycles, measured by schedules rather than suns. Ricks moved through these halls with practiced familiarity. Some walked with purpose, coats stained from experiments still unresolved. Others drifted, hands in pockets, minds elsewhere, repeating routes they had walked countless times before. No one was lost. There was nowhere to be lost to. Apartments formed clusters, stacked in dense layers, each one nearly identical to the next. Rooms designed to be functional, not personal. Walls strong enough to contain explosions, floors easy to repair, furniture chosen for durability rather than comfort. It was not a place meant to inspire. It was a place meant to work. Inside these spaces, Ricks lived lives that looked surprisingly ordinary. They slept. They ate. They maintained equipment. They filed reports. Some held positions of authority, overseeing sectors of the Citadel's infrastructure. Others took on menial roles, not because they lacked intelligence, but because even genius, when multiplied endlessly, requires organization. There were factories producing standardized portal fluid, labs dedicated not to discovery, but to maintenance and replication, security divisions ensuring that disputes between Ricks did not escalate into reality-threatening events. The Citadel ran smoothly because it was designed by minds that understood exactly how things broke. Mortis filled the spaces between these systems. They attended schools that resembled simplified versions of institutions found across the multiverse. Classrooms where learning was shallow, repetitive, and intentionally limited. Not because Mortis could not learn more, but because no one had decided they should. Education here was not about growth. It was about predictability. Some Mortys were assigned jobs early. Factory work, service roles, errands for Ricks, who no longer wanted to leave the Citadel themselves. Others wandered unsupervised, forming small communities in forgotten sections of the structure. They adapted, as Mortis always did, finding meaning in fragments, humor in bleakness, companionship in shared survival. Above them all, the Citadel loomed as a complete system, self-sustaining, efficient, and emotionally distant. What made the Citadel unique was not its technology. Rick Sanchez had built more impressive things alone. What made it different was scale. Everything here existed in excess intelligence, excess redundancy, excess control. And yet, for many Ricks, this was preferable to the alternative. The multiverse outside was loud, unregulated, full of beings who could not comprehend the weight of infinite possibility. Inside the Citadel, expectations were shared, assumptions aligned. There was comfort in knowing that no one here would ask questions that mattered. Over time, hierarchy solidified. Certain Ricks gained influence not through brilliance, but through patience. They learned how systems behaved, how crowds moved, how rules could be shaped to preserve stability rather than truth. The council emerged from this understanding. It was not an act of tyranny, nor was it born from idealism. It was a committee of convenience, formed to manage disputes and maintain continuity. Decisions were made collectively, diluted by consensus, stripped of urgency. No Rick truly ruled, because none of them truly cared enough to try. The Citadel did not oppress through force. It pacified through routine. Days blurred together, projects were started and abandoned, ambition softened. A Rick who once destroyed civilizations without hesitation could spend weeks recalibrating a device that already worked, simply because there was nothing else demanding attention. This was the quiet cost of infinite safety. Outside the Citadel, risk defined existence. Inside it, risk was minimized, managed, archived. Even violence, when it occurred, felt procedural, contained, resolved by departments designed for that exact outcome. Life continued, children grew older, Mortys aged into adults within a system that had no real place for them beyond continued utility. Some became workers. Some disappeared into forgotten sectors. A few learned enough to understand the shape of the cage they lived in. Ricks, meanwhile, rarely changed at all. Immortality, or something close to it, had a way of flattening time. Without consequences that truly mattered, growth became optional. And yet, beneath the steady hum of the Citadel's machinery, something subtle persisted. A low-level dissatisfaction, not loud enough to disrupt order, not focused enough to become rebellion, just a quiet awareness. Some Ricks began to notice how often they encountered versions of themselves performing the same tasks, holding the same expressions, making the same choices. Individuality, once a defining trait, began to feel cosmetic. Mortis noticed it too. Though they lacked the language to describe it, they sensed the imbalance. The way their lives were shaped by decisions they had no part in making. The Citadel was efficient, but it was not alive in the way a universe was alive. It did not evolve naturally. It adjusted only when forced. And so it drifted. Through extra-dimensional space, untouched by stars or gravity, carrying within it a population that had traded infinite possibility for controlled repetition. From the outside, the Citadel looked stable, unbreakable, a monument to intelligence asserting dominance over chaos. From the inside, it felt like standing still in a place that never slept. The systems worked. The rules held. Nothing collapsed. But nothing truly moved forward either. And in that stillness, unnoticed by most, a difference began to emerge. A Morty who did not quite fit, a pattern that did not repeat as expected. At first, it registered as a statistical anomaly, a deviation too small to matter. But even in a place built to eliminate unpredictability, difference, once it appears, has a way of growing. Slowly, quietly, patiently. The Citadel continued on, unaware that its greatest disruption was not coming from outside forces, but from within the very population it had dismissed as background noise. And so the city drifted through the dark, orderly and calm, carrying the seeds of its own unraveling in silence. In a place built to make every day feel the same, difference was easy to miss at first. The Citadel had been designed for repetition. Its streets, its corridors, its schools, even its small corners of commerce were arranged to keep life moving in predictable loops. A Rick could wake, work, eat, and disappear back into a room that looked like every other room, and the day would close behind him without leaving a mark. Mortis lived inside those loops more completely than anyone. They were the constant background of the Citadel, the movement that filled space without being acknowledged. They wore similar clothes, learned similar lessons, took similar jobs, and grew into similar shapes of adulthood. Even their small differences tended to be absorbed by the system and filed away as harmless variation. And yet, even here, the multiverse still breathed. Not loudly, not openly, but in quiet, statistical ways that no amount of structure could fully erase. A slightly different decision, a slightly different expression, a mind that lingered a moment longer on a question no one wanted asked. That was how it began. Not with rebellion, but with attention. Some Mortys had learned to survive by disappearing. They stayed quiet, stayed agreeable, stayed small. They adapted to the expectation that they were not meant to matter. But one Morty moved through the Citadel as though he was watching it, not just living in it, not just enduring it, but studying the way it held itself together. He paid attention to where guards stood and where they did not. He noticed which hallways were monitored and which were forgotten. He learned the rhythms of traffic, the quiet hours, the patterns of shift changes, the way authority moved like a slow tide from one sector to another. He did not draw attention to himself because attention was a kind of gravity. Once it found you, it shaped what you could become. So he stayed ordinary. He moved with the crowds and made himself part of the blur. He attended the places Mortis were expected to attend. He waited in lines when Mortis waited in lines. He listened more than he spoke. And he carried himself with a calm that could be mistaken for dullness. In the Citadel, dullness was a kind of camouflage. It helped that no one was truly looking. Ricks, in general, did not watch Mortis closely unless they had a reason. They had built a world where Mortis were everywhere, which meant Mortis were nowhere in particular. Their presence was normalized until it became invisible. The council had rules for Mortis, but not curiosity about them. The schools taught Mortis what was safe to teach. The workplaces trained Mortis to do tasks that kept the Citadel running, and the Citadel rewarded compliance with routine. Routine kept people tired. Tired people did not ask questions. And yet questions existed quietly in the spaces routine could not fill. The Morty who did not belong carried those questions without showing them. He wondered why the Citadel needed so many Mortys if Mortis were truly meaningless. He wondered why Ricks had built an entire city to protect themselves from chaos, if they claimed to be above fear. He wondered why the smartest beings in existence had chosen to live in a place that felt like a copy of a copy of a copy. He wondered most of all, why a Morty had to be a Morty. These were not thoughts he shared. They were not thoughts he even allowed to rise too close to the surface. They were kept deep, where they could not be read in his face, where they could not alter his posture or the way he walked. If the Citadel had taught Mortis anything well, it was this. Survival required concealment. In time, concealment became strategy. The first sign that something was different about him did not appear in a classroom or on a street. It appeared in the Citadel's systems, in the faint traces of activity that seemed slightly too precise to be accidental. Records shifted. Surveillance feeds looped at convenient moments. Small administrative glitches appeared and then resolved themselves before anyone could investigate. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the smallest evidence of a mind touching the Citadel's machinery. At the scale the Citadel operated on, small evidence could be ignored. It often was. The Citadel was filled with anomalies. Experimental spills, portal fluctuations, unauthorized devices, and personal disputes among Ricks that required constant cleanup. The system was designed to absorb disorder without stopping, so the evidence disappeared into the noise. The Morty who did not belong learned to make the noise work for him. He learned the value of plausible chaos. He learned that a small disruption, if framed like the kind of disruption Ricks created every day, would never be investigated. He learned that the Citadel did not collapse from mistakes. It collapsed only from patterns. And he learned to hide patterns inside randomness. Somewhere in the Citadel, there were labs and workshops that were never fully secured because Ricks assumed no one else could understand what was inside. Some places were considered too dangerous for Mortis, which meant they were rarely monitored for Morty activity at all. He found those places, not through force, but through time and observation. And in those quiet corners, he began to gather what he needed. Not weapons, not in the way a frightened mind might imagine, but tools. Access knowledge. The kind of knowledge that could not be taught in Morty school. After the Citadel fell, the multiverse did not pause. There was no moment of silence shared across realities, no universal acknowledgement that something monumental had ended. Infinity does not mark its own turning points. It simply continues, vast and unbothered, absorbing change the way an ocean absorbs a single falling star. The debris of the Citadel drifted for a long time. Fragments of streets and corridors, once crowded with movement, now floated empty through extra-dimensional space. Lights flickered until their power ran out. Doors opened to nothing. Signs still pointed toward places that no longer existed. Some pieces were claimed by nearby realities, pulled in by gravity or chance. Others vanished through unstable portals, scattered into universes that would never know what they were passing through. The Citadel had been designed to feel permanent. Its remains were not. Those who escaped carried the collapse with them in quieter ways. Ricks emerged into a multiverse that no longer bent subtly in their favor. Travel felt different. Calculations took longer. Assumptions that had once held across every jump now failed without warning. Some Ricks responded with anger, others with denial. Many attempted instinctively to rebuild something familiar, new hubs, new alliances, new rules that might recreate the sense of safety they had lost. But nothing aligned the same way anymore. Without the Central Finite Curve, the multiverse no longer guaranteed them primacy. There were worlds where their intelligence was impressive, but insufficient. Places where power took forms that could not be out-invented or out-thought. For some Ricks, this became intolerable. They retreated into isolation, choosing smaller loops of reality where control could still be asserted. Others pushed outward aggressively, trying to dominate environments that no longer responded predictably. A few did something rarer. They adapted. These Ricks learned caution. They learned humility in ways that felt foreign and uncomfortable. They discovered that survival did not always come from being the smartest presence in the room, but from knowing when to leave it. Mortis, scattered across the multiverse, experienced the aftermath differently. Many had lost the only structure they had ever known. The Citadel, for all its cruelty and indifference, had provided consistency. Without it, Mortis were forced to define themselves without a template. Some found freedom quickly, some found danger, some found nothing at all. But one thing changed for all of them. They were no longer guaranteed to be secondary by design. In worlds beyond the curve, identity was not predetermined by proximity to a Rick. Outcomes were not filtered to maintain hierarchy. A Morty could be insignificant or extraordinary for reasons that belong to the universe itself, not to a system imposed from outside. This did not make life fair. It made it honest. And honesty, in an infinite multiverse, is a rare condition. The Morty who did not belong traveled onward, further from the collapse than most ever would. He moved through realities that did not mirror one another neatly. Places where intelligence did not always translate into power, and power did not always survive contact with meaning. He did not search for a throne. He did not seek to lead. Leadership implies permanence, and permanence had never been his goal. What he sought was distance. Distance from expectations that had defined him without consent. Distance from systems that mistook predictability for stability. Distance from a universe curated to protect one kind of mind at the expense of all others. Beyond the curve, there was no promise that suffering would lessen, no guarantee that existence would become kinder. There were only possibilities unshaped by fear of inferiority. That was enough. The multiverse adjusted slowly to its new shape. Without the curve's constraint, realities brushed against one another in unfamiliar ways. New interactions formed. Old barriers dissolved. Some universes encountered threats they had never faced before. Others discovered opportunities they had never been allowed to imagine. Change spread unevenly, as it always does, but it spread. The idea that one intelligence could sit safely at the center of everything faded. Not as a dramatic revelation, but as a practical truth. Survival now required awareness, not dominance. Adaptation, not control. Somewhere, in a universe that no longer fit neatly on any map, the Morty who did not belong continued forward. He did not know what he would become. That uncertainty no longer felt like a flaw. In the end, the Citadel had not fallen because it was attacked. It fell because it tried to make infinity small enough to manage. Infinity does not tolerate that for long. The curve had not broken because it was poorly built. It broke because it was built to protect an idea that could not survive exposure to the wider truth. That truth remained, quiet and persistent. No system can guarantee superiority forever. No intelligence can insulate itself completely from consequence. No structure, no matter how clever, can replace the complexity of an unfiltered universe. The Citadel had been a pause in the multiverse's natural motion, a long moment of controlled repetition. Now that pause had ended. What remained was movement. Stars burned, worlds formed and collapsed. Lives intersected briefly and then drifted apart. And somewhere among them, no longer defined by shadow or proximity, a former Morty moved through infinity on his own terms. Not special because the universe said so. Not important because a system allowed it, but free to discover what those words might mean without permission. The multiverse did not watch him go. It did not need to. It simply continued, vast and indifferent, making room for every possible future, including ones that had never been allowed to exist before. And in that quiet, endless unfolding, the story of the Citadel ended not with an echo, but with space enough for something new to begin. The kind of knowledge that turned a system from an unchangeable wall into a solvable puzzle. It was around this time that the Citadel began to experience another kind of disturbance. Ricks were being drawn into certain disappearances, certain traces, certain cases that felt strangely familiar. There was talk, in the lower-level currents of Citadel life, of a Rick killer somewhere out in the multiverse. A figure that seemed to be moving through realities, leaving damaged versions of what Ricks believed they owned. Their safety, their superiority, their control. To many, it sounded like the multiverse's usual cruelty. To others, it sounded like something more personal. In the chaos of those fears, a particular partnership formed, one that would matter later. A Morty traveling alongside a Rick who was not aligned with the Citadel's comfort. A Rick who drifted in and out of its orbit, refusing its routine, disrupting its assumptions simply by existing beyond its rules. That Morty was not the one who did not belong, but their paths circled the same history, like planets around the same dark star. The Morty who did not belong stayed on the Citadel, where the real structure was. He watched the way anxiety moved through the city. He watched security tighten and loosen in waves. He watched which Ricks panicked and which ones pretended not to. Fear, he noticed, made Ricks predictable. The smarter a Rick was, the more convinced he was that he could control anything, and the more offended he became when evidence suggested otherwise. That offense became urgency. Urgency became carelessness. The Morty who did not belong used carelessness the way a physicist uses gravity, not fighting it, not resisting it, just letting it pull things where they naturally wanted to go. It would have been easy in a different story for this to be the moment where everything turned into a loud, sharp conflict. The Citadel was filled with weapons, with technology, with enough power to rip holes through reality itself. But this Morty did not move like that. He moved like the Citadel moved, slowly, methodically, almost gently. He did not need to destroy the system in one swing. He only needed to understand how the system destroyed itself. Because the Citadel, for all its strength, had a weakness that it could not admit. It was built by minds that assumed they would always remain above consequence. It was governed by a council that assumed no one inside the Citadel could threaten it, because everyone inside the Citadel was fundamentally the same. And sameness was considered safe. The Morty who did not belong understood that assumption better than anyone. He understood it because it was the very thing he could use. To a Rick, a Morty was not a rival. A Morty was not an equal. A Morty was a shadow, a buffer, a tool. Even when a Morty was intelligent, Ricks often read that intelligence as a joke, an accident, a temporary glitch. This was the Citadel's comfort, and comfort makes a system soft at the center. In the background of Citadel life, there were stories about a Morty with an eye patch, stories whispered more than spoken aloud, rumors that drifted through the streets like dust, never settling long enough to be confirmed. An eye patch was a simple thing. It was not advanced technology. It was not a weapon. It was not even particularly rare in a city filled with injury and augmentation. But symbols did not need to be complex to be powerful. A Morty with an eye patch suggested a Morty who had been through something and come out changed. A Morty who looked like he had survived a narrative Ricks preferred to own for themselves. Some dismissed it, some laughed, some found it faintly unsettling. The Morty who did not belong did not need everyone to believe. He only needed the idea to exist. Because the Citadel did not run purely on technology. It ran on psychology, on shared assumptions, on unspoken agreements, on a collective belief that Ricks were the only ones who mattered. A single crack in that belief could spread, not quickly, but inevitably. He watched the Citadel's social layers the way someone might watch an ant colony. He observed how the Mortys clustered, how the Ricks separated into roles, how the council maintained its authority through bureaucracy rather than force. He learned where influence was weakest. He learned where hope could be planted. Not hope in the warm sense, not comfort, but hope as a form of movement. The belief that life could be different, which is the first step in making it so. In the Citadel, Mortis lived with a constant dull pressure, a sense that they were meant to endure and nothing else. That pressure did not always create rebellion. Often it created resignation. But resignation was not stable forever. All it needed was a direction. The Morty who did not belong became that direction without ever announcing himself. He began to position himself in the places where decisions were made, not openly, but in the margins, near administrative offices, near transit hubs, near the parts of the Citadel where information moved. He learned that the Citadel, like any large structure, was held together by flow. Flow of resources, flow of schedules, flow of records. Flow could be redirected, gently, quietly, without anyone noticing until it mattered. He made sure people saw what they needed to see and missed what they needed to miss. He shaped perceptions the way Rick shaped matter, and all the while he remained what he appeared to be, a Morty among Mortys. Another face in the crowd. As time passed, the city began to feel, in a subtle way, less stable. Not because anything had broken yet, but because the sense of inevitability that once hung over the Citadel started to thin. People noticed small contradictions. Mortis noticed that some Mortis were being treated differently. Ricks noticed that their systems were not as perfect as they claimed. Even the council, comfortable in its routines, began to sense that the Citadel's calm was changing into something else. Not panic, not chaos, anticipation. And anticipation is dangerous in a place built to suppress surprise. It was during this quiet buildup that the Morty who did not belong prepared something larger than simple disruptions. He began to shape an outcome. He understood that the Citadel could survive crime because it had departments for crime. It could survive violence because it had weapons and security. It could survive scandal because it had propaganda and public denial. But there was one thing it could not survive intact: a change in what its citizens believed was possible. If Mortis believed they could matter, the Citadel's entire structure would need to adjust. If Ricks believed Mortis could threaten them, the Citadel would either become a fortress or fall into paranoia. If the Council's legitimacy cracked, the city would lose the thin thread of shared agreement that made its rules real. The Morty who did not belong set his work toward that thread. He did not rush. He did not flare. He waited for the right moment, because the multiverse had taught him patience in its harshest form. An infinite world makes impulsive action feel small. It teaches the value of timing. He watched the Citadel drift through space, watched it continue its routines, watched the way it lulled itself into believing it was permanent. And in that slow drift, he prepared to introduce the Citadel to something it had not planned for. A Morty who could not be ignored, not because he demanded attention, but because the system would be forced to notice him. Like a stone placed carefully in the path of a machine, timed so precisely that the machine's own motion would do the rest. By the end of this chapter of the Citadel's life, nothing had exploded yet. No alarms had blared long enough to wake the entire city. The streets still moved, the factories still ran, the schools still held their quiet classes. From a distance, it all looked peaceful. But beneath that peace, the shape of the future had shifted. A plan had matured inside the city's invisible corners. And the Morty who did not belong, still moving with the crowds, still wearing the face of normalcy, carried the beginning of the Citadel's ending with him as calmly as a bedtime thought. Power in the Citadel rarely announced itself. It did not arrive with ceremony or conquest. It did not need to. The Citadel had been built by minds that understood leverage better than force, and so power lived in systems rather than individuals. It lived in procedures, approvals, classifications, and permissions. It lived in who controlled access, who set schedules, who decided which problems mattered enough to be addressed. For a long time, the Council of Ricks served as the visible shape of that power. They met in chambers designed to feel authoritative without being inspiring. Elevated seats, controlled lighting, architecture that suggested importance while discouraging emotional investment. Decisions were filtered through layers of consensus, each layer sanding down urgency until what remained felt inevitable rather than chosen. This suited the Citadel. When no one appeared to be fully in charge, no one could be fully blamed. Responsibility diffused outward until it became background radiation. Most Ricks were content with this arrangement. They did not want to rule. They wanted to be left alone. The council existed to ensure that nothing interfered too much with that desire. Mortis, meanwhile, lived under power without ever touching it. They felt its effects in curfews, assignments, relocations, and quiet enforcement, but they were never invited to understand its mechanisms. This distance was intentional. Power is safest when it is abstract, but abstraction has a weakness. It relies on belief. The Citadel functioned because most of its inhabitants believed, consciously or not, that its structure was permanent, that there was no realistic alternative, that whatever flaws existed were preferable to the chaos beyond its walls. The Morty who did not belong understood this. He understood that to change the Citadel, it would not be enough to damage its machinery. The machinery could be repaired. It would not be enough to remove individuals. New ones would take their place. What needed to change was the idea of who power could belong to. The opportunity arrived quietly, the way such things often do. Discontent had been accumulating for some time. Among Mortis, it took the form of exhaustion and quiet resentment. Among Ricks, it appeared as irritation with bureaucracy, with inefficiency, with a council that no longer seemed to represent even their limited interests. The Citadel had grown too large to feel personal, too layered to feel responsive. And so, when the idea of an election surfaced, it did not feel radical. It felt procedural, a refinement, an update. The council, in its own way, believed that allowing a controlled expression of choice would release pressure without altering the system's foundations. Elections could be managed. Narratives could be shaped. Outcomes could be guided. Democracy, stripped of consequence, was just another maintenance routine. Candidates appeared as expected. Ricks with polished images. Ricks who promised efficiency, security, a return to order. Ricks who spoke in the familiar language of superiority and reassurance, offering stability to those who already had more than enough. And among them, almost unnoticed at first, was a Morty. The idea alone should have ended everything. But it didn't. Because the Citadel had already made Mortis visible enough to be useful, yet invisible enough to feel harmless. A Morty candidate registered as novelty rather than threat, something to be tolerated, even quietly encouraged, as proof that the system was fair. The Morty who did not belong allowed that assumption to stand. He did not campaign like a Rick. He did not posture or dominate. His presence contrasted sharply with the familiar arrogance of his opponents, and that contrast carried weight. To Mortis, it felt like recognition. To Ricks, it felt like entertainment. The Citadel watched itself change without quite believing it was happening. Campaign materials spread through the city. Posters layered over old warnings and regulations. Symbols replaced rules for a time. Mortys gathered in larger numbers, not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. Curiosity is dangerous in systems designed to suppress it. The Morty who did not belong spoke to conditions rather than ideology. He aligned himself with exhaustion, with the shared sense that life in the Citadel had become stagnant and unfair. He did not promise revolution. He suggested correction, and correction felt safe. As the election progressed, tensions surfaced. Ricks debated outcomes not because they feared losing power, but because they feared inconvenience. The idea that the Citadel might require adaptation unsettled them more than the idea of Mortis gaining representation. They underestimated how deeply belief had already shifted. Mortis began to imagine a Citadel that did not simply happen to them, but included them. That imagination did not need to be fully articulated to be effective. It moved through the population like a quiet current. Even some Ricks felt it. Not hope exactly, but interest. Something different. On the day the results were announced, the Citadel held its breath without realizing it. The outcome was decisive. A Morty had been elected. For a moment, nothing happened. The Citadel did not collapse. The systems did not fail. Reality did not tear itself apart. That, more than anything, unsettled the council. Power had changed hands, at least symbolically, and the universe had not objected. The Morty who did not belong took office without ceremony. There was no dramatic transition, no sudden purge. The Citadel continued its routines, because routines are slow to accept that they no longer serve the same purpose. But subtle changes followed. Investigations began. Audits were ordered, records were reviewed with an attention they had not received in years. The Citadel's own systems, designed for control, were now being used for exposure. Corruption surfaced, not as isolated incidents, but as structure. The ways resources had been hoarded, the ways Mortis had been exploited, the ways authority had insulated itself from accountability, all became visible. Visibility, once introduced, is difficult to contain. Protests followed. Not violent at first. Gatherings, crowds, Mortys standing together in places they had previously passed through without stopping. Ricks reacted with confusion more than anger. This was not how things were supposed to work. The Citadel was not built for mass movement driven by belief. The council attempted to reassert control. That attempt failed. The failure was not dramatic, but it was absolute. The Citadel's authority had always depended on the assumption that it was unquestionable. Once questioned openly, it had no deeper foundation to fall back on. When violence finally came, It did not come as a single event. It arrived in fragments, riots in some sectors, crackdowns in others, conflicting orders issued by a council that no longer spoke with one voice. Through it all, the Morty who did not belong remained composed. He had not created the Citadel's instability. He had revealed it. When the council was finally dismantled, it happened with a quiet inevitability. Systems deactivated, positions dissolved, the architecture of authority emptied out, leaving behind rooms that had once felt powerful and now felt simply large. The Citadel entered a new phase. It was no longer pretending to be neutral. It was no longer pretending to be static. For the first time in its existence, it was being actively shaped by someone who had grown up inside its blind spots. And yet, this was not an ending. The Morty who did not belong had not come this far to inherit the Citadel as it was. He understood that power, once visible, invites resistance. That control, once centralized, invites challenge. What he wanted was not to rule the Citadel forever. What he wanted was to escape its gravity. As the city adjusted to its new leadership, deeper mechanisms began to shift. Projects were approved that had nothing to do with governance. Energy was redirected, infrastructure modified under the guise of reform. The Citadel believed it was healing. In truth, it was being repurposed. Few noticed, fewer understood. The Citadel drifted on, still massive, still functional, still alive with activity. But its future was no longer aligned with its past. The shape of power had changed, and with it, the trajectory of everything that depended on it. Somewhere deep within the Citadel's core systems, calculations were being run that had nothing to do with elections or justice. Calculations about boundaries, about limits, about escape. The Morty who did not belong had reached the height of influence without ever raising his voice. And from that height, he could finally see what needed to be done next. Long before the Citadel had elections, councils, or streets filled with passing crowds, there was a quieter decision that shaped everything that followed. It was not made in a single moment. It was not announced. It did not even feel like a boundary at first. It felt like a preference. In the early days of interdimensional travel, Rick Sanchez discovered what most beings never would. That infinity was not just vast, it was uneven. Some universes were ruled by chance, others by beings more powerful, more ancient, more incomprehensible than anything Rick could confront directly. In some realities, intelligence like Rick's meant nothing at all. There were universes where gods were real. Universes where physics bent toward different constants. Universes where Rick Sanchez was not the smartest mind in the room, or the planet, or the cosmos. Those universes were not comfortable. Not because Rick feared challenge in the way lesser minds feared it, but because challenge without leverage was not curiosity. It was exposure. It was vulnerability without purpose. And Rick Sanchez did not build his life around vulnerability. So, over time, a separation emerged. Not a wall in the physical sense, but a conceptual filter, a way of organizing infinity into something survivable. A way of ensuring that when Ricks traveled, they traveled among worlds where intelligence like theirs still mattered. The Central Finite Curve was not created as a prison. It was created as a shelter. Within it existed only those universes where Rick Sanchez, in one form or another, stood at the peak of intellect, where no external being surpassed him in understanding, manipulation, or technological mastery. Outside it lay the rest of infinity, true infinity, unfiltered, indifferent. The curve allowed Ricks to exist in a multiverse that reinforced their identity rather than challenged it. It turned infinite possibility into a curated space where genius remained supreme. Most Ricks never questioned it. To them, the curve was simply how reality worked, the natural shape of things. A background assumption built so deeply into their understanding of the multiverse that it felt less like a decision and more like a law. The Citadel, built later, inherited this assumption without reflection. It existed entirely within the curve, drifting through a portion of reality already shaped to favor its inhabitants. This was why the Citadel felt stable, why threats were manageable, why chaos never quite exceeded containment. The Citadel was order built inside an already limited infinity, and limits, once normalized, are difficult to see. The Morty who did not belong saw them. He did not understand the curve all at once. Knowledge like that is never revealed suddenly. It accumulates, it connects, it forms a shape over time. He began with questions about travel. Why some coordinates were accessible and others were not. Why certain anomalies appeared consistently while others never occurred at all. Why entire classes of universes existed only as theoretical references, never as destinations. He studied the Citadel's archives, not openly but indirectly, through maintenance logs, through outdated records, through systems no longer considered important because their conclusions had already been accepted. That was where the curve left its traces. The Central Finite Curve was not just a map. It was an active process, a boundary maintained through vast amounts of computation and energy, constantly filtering, redirecting, and excluding realities that did not meet its criteria. It was a machine as much as it was an idea, and it required upkeep. The Citadel was part of that upkeep. Deep within its structure were systems that did not serve daily life, systems that did not regulate traffic or production or security, systems that hummed quietly, drawing power, running calculations that most Ricks had long stopped thinking about. These systems maintained the curve. The Morty who did not belong understood the significance of this slowly, the way someone realizes they have been living inside a carefully constructed room only after noticing the seams in the walls. The curve explained everything. It explained why Ricks felt safe enough to grow complacent, why the Citadel could exist without external threats tearing it apart, why intelligence inside this space had become predictable. The curve was not just protecting Ricks from greater beings, it was protecting them from insignificance. To a Rick, meaning came from superiority, from being the one who understood more, who saw further, who bent reality rather than submitting to it. The curve ensured that this relationship never fundamentally changed, but in doing so, it flattened the multiverse. Difference still existed, but only within acceptable bounds. Universes varied in culture, in aesthetics, in minor physical laws, but never in ways that truly destabilized the hierarchy at the top. The Morty who did not belong saw this not as a flaw, but as an opportunity. Because any system built to protect identity becomes fragile when that identity is challenged. He did not hate the curve in the way a revolutionary hates a wall. Hatred implies emotional investment. He saw it the way an engineer sees a structure that has outlived its original purpose. The curve had been built to give Ricks freedom. Now it limited everyone else. Mortis most of all. Within the curve, Mortis were guaranteed to remain subordinate. Their potential, whatever it might have been in other universes, was capped by design. They existed in a space where the smartest being was always a Rick. That was not an accident. The Morty who did not belong understood, with a clarity that settled into him without drama, that the curve was the true prison, not the Citadel, not the council, not the routines of daily life. The curve, as long as it existed, power would always bend back toward the same center. And so his plans shifted. The election had given him access. The reforms had given him cover. The Citadel's belief that it was being healed allowed deeper projects to proceed without scrutiny. Energy was rerouted. Systems were consolidated. Infrastructure upgrades were approved that appeared necessary for efficiency, for safety, for modernization. In truth, they were preparing for something else. The Morty who did not belong studied the curve the way someone studies a lock, not to break it violently, but to understand how it held itself closed. He learned that the curve was not absolute. It was enforced, maintained by choice, even if that choice had become automatic. He learned that removing it would not destroy the multiverse. It would simply restore it. The risk was not cosmic collapse. The risk was uncertainty. Without the curve, Ricks would no longer be guaranteed supremacy. They would travel into universes where intelligence did not confer control, where beings existed that could not be outthought or outbuilt, where Rick Sanchez was simply another entity, subject to forces larger than himself. That prospect terrified many Ricks more than death. The Citadel had been built to avoid that feeling. The Morty who did not belong felt no such fear. He had grown up powerless, insignificant by design. For him, uncertainty was not a threat. It was a return to honesty. As preparations continued, the Citadel moved closer to a breaking point without realizing it. Most of its inhabitants still believed the story they had always believed, that whatever changes were happening, they were happening within safe limits. They did not understand that the limits themselves were under review. Some Ricks sensed it faintly. They felt a disturbance in the underlying logic of things. Calculations returned unfamiliar results. Projections felt incomplete. Assumptions that had held for lifetimes began to wobble. They blamed system lag, or administrative incompetence, or the inevitable friction of reform. None of them looked deeply enough. Deep within the Citadel, the systems that maintained the curve approached a moment of transition. Energy levels spiked and stabilized. Redundancies were quietly disabled. Safeguards were reclassified as optional. The Morty who did not belong stood at the edge of a choice that had no precedent. Removing the curve would not make him ruler of anything. It would not give Mortis instant freedom or equality. It would not fix the Citadel. It would simply end a lie, the lie that the multiverse had been naturally shaped in Rick's image, the lie that intelligence deserved insulation from consequence, the lie that safety was preferable to truth. As the final calculations neared completion, the Citadel remained outwardly calm. Streets were still busy. Factories still ran. Mortys still went to school. Ricks still argued about trivialities. From the outside, nothing suggested that the structure of reality itself was about to change. That is how most profound changes arrive. Quietly, without announcement, without certainty. The Morty who did not belong did not hesitate. Hesitation belongs to those who still believe in permission. When the curve finally weakened, it did not shatter in a single dramatic instant. It loosened. It thinned. Pathways that had once been impossible flickered into existence. The multiverse, long constrained, began to breathe outward again. For the first time since its creation, the Citadel was no longer guaranteed safety by the structure of reality itself. And the Morty who did not belong, having done what he came to do, prepared to leave. Because his goal had never been to live in a world ruled by Ricks or Mortis. His goal was to reach a place where no one ruled by default. Beyond the curve lay uncertainty, danger, and infinite difference. To a Rick, that was unacceptable. To a Morty who had learned to live without power, it felt like freedom. The Citadel drifted on, unaware that its foundation had changed. Its future would now be shaped by forces it could not predict or control. And somewhere beyond the edge of a boundary that no longer fully existed, the multiverse waited, vast and unfiltered, ready to remind everyone what infinity truly meant. The first sign that something had truly changed was not an explosion. It was silence. A subtle pause in the Citadel's background rhythm, so brief that most inhabitants never consciously noticed it. Machines continued to hum, lights remained steady, and transit lanes stayed open. Yet beneath those familiar sounds, a deeper cadence had shifted. The Citadel no longer sat inside a guaranteed shape of reality. The Central Finite Curve, weakened and unraveling, had stopped doing the quiet work it had always done. The multiverse around the Citadel was no longer filtered to favor its existence. Probability no longer leaned gently in its direction. For the first time, the Citadel was exposed. Ricks began to feel it as irritation. Calculations that once resolved cleanly now produced ambiguous results. Portal coordinates returned unfamiliar edge cases. Threat models expanded beyond acceptable ranges. To a Rick, ambiguity was not frightening in the abstract. It was frustrating. It meant effort. It meant attention. Across the city, diagnostics ran more frequently. Departments blamed one another. Systems attempted to compensate for conditions they had never been designed to address. The Citadel had always relied on the assumption that reality itself was on its side. Now, reality was indifferent. As instability spread, it did not spread evenly. Some sectors experienced nothing more than brief fluctuations. Others suffered cascading failures as systems dependent on the curve's constraints encountered inputs they could not reconcile. Security tightened without clarity on what it was tightening against. The Council, already diminished, struggled to interpret reports that contradicted centuries of embedded assumptions. Their authority, once symbolic, now carried the weight of genuine uncertainty, and they were not equipped to bear it. The Morty who did not belong did not watch the Citadel unravel with satisfaction. Satisfaction implies attachment. He observed it the way one observes weather from behind glass, calmly, attentively, aware that what was happening was neither punishment nor justice, but consequence. The Citadel had been built as a closed system inside a controlled infinity. Remove the control, and the system would behave as any closed system does when exposed to new variables. It would fail at its weakest points first. Energy grids began to overload, not because they lacked capacity, but because they were optimized for a narrower range of outcomes. Defensive measures activated against threats that no longer followed expected patterns. Interdimensional traffic spiked as Ricks attempted to leave all at once, each trying to outpace the others. Crowds formed. Mortises, long conditioned to follow routines, suddenly found themselves without clear instruction. Schedules dissolved, assignments conflicted, authority fragmented. In the absence of certainty, fear filled the gaps. The Morty who did not belong had already moved past the places where fear would slow him. His work inside the Citadel was complete. The systems he needed were primed. The path he required was open. He moved deeper, toward the Citadel's core. The core was not a single room, nor a single machine. It was a convergence of structures layered over one another, each added by different Ricks at different times, each solving a problem that had once seemed urgent. Together, they formed a dense knot of infrastructure that governed power, travel, and containment. This was where the Citadel's illusion of permanence lived. As the curve weakened further, stresses accumulated here faster than anywhere else. Redundancies activated, then failed. Safeguards contradicted one another. Automated systems escalated responses without understanding the new context. The Citadel was trying to protect itself from a threat it had never acknowledged. The Morty who did not belong moved through these layers with practiced ease. He had studied their design not as a builder, but as a reader. He knew where Ricks tended to overcomplicate, where they trusted cleverness over resilience. He did not sabotage indiscriminately. He did not need to. He applied pressure precisely where the structure was already under strain. Containment fields flickered. Structural stabilizers drifted out of sync. The Citadel's mass, once carefully balanced in extra-dimensional space, began to pull against itself. From the outside, the first visible signs appeared. Fragments of debris drifted free, not violently, but gently, as if the city were shedding excess weight. Energy flares rippled across its surface, bright against the dark. Ricks noticed now. Panic spread unevenly. Some attempted to assert control through force. Others focused on escape. Many froze, caught between disbelief and anger. The Citadel's greatest weakness revealed itself fully in that moment. It had never taught its inhabitants how to respond to loss of control. Mortis scattered through the corridors, some trying to find shelter, others drawn instinctively toward exits that might no longer exist. The structures that had confined them now offered no guidance. The Morty who did not belong passed through these spaces unseen, not because he was hidden, but because attention had turned inward. Everyone was busy confronting the collapse of their assumptions. As the core destabilized further, the Citadel's systems reached a point where containment was no longer possible. Energy surged through conduits never meant to carry it. Structural segments tore loose, colliding in slow, catastrophic arcs. The destruction was not sudden. It unfolded like a long exhale. Explosions bloomed without sound. Their force diffused across extra-dimensional space. Whole districts fractured and drifted away. lights still on, routines frozen mid-motion. Inside, gravity shifted unpredictably. Up became suggestion, down lost meaning. The Citadel's architecture, once rigid and ordered, transformed into a drifting lattice of broken intention. The Morty who did not belong reached the final threshold. Here, at the edge of the Citadel's deepest systems, he paused, not in doubt, in recognition. The Citadel had been his home, not in a sentimental sense, but in the factual one. It had shaped him, constrained him, taught him how power operated by denying him access to it. Everything he had become was, in some way, a response to this place. He did not look back. Looking back implies regret. He initiated his departure. The escape was not dramatic. There was no race against a countdown, no last-second reversal. The path outward had been prepared long ago, insulated from the Citadel's failing systems. As he crossed the boundary, the Citadel's collapse accelerated behind him. The core finally gave way. What followed was not a single explosion, but a cascade. Energy once tightly bound dispersed outward, tearing through the remaining structure. The Citadel folded in on itself, pieces vanishing into unstable portals or scattering into the surrounding void. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful. A city dissolving into light and shadow, its rigid geometry undone, its certainty erased. Ricks who escaped carried with them fragments of belief that would no longer hold. Mortis who survived did so without the framework that had defined their lives. The Citadel's destruction did not free anyone completely, but it removed the illusion that safety had been guaranteed. And beyond the collapsing wreckage, something else waited. The multiverse unfiltered. The Morty who did not belong emerged into a region of reality untouched by the curve. Here, the background noise of existence felt different, less predictable, more alive. There were no assurances, no hierarchy enforced by design, no promise that intelligence would protect him from what lay ahead. That was acceptable. For the first time, he existed in a space where outcomes were not pre-selected, where superiority was not baked into the structure of reality, where identity was not inherited from a template. He did not know what he would find beyond this point. He did not need to. The purpose of his journey had never been certainty. It had been possibility. Behind him, the Citadel continued to fall, its remnants drifting like ash through the void. Ahead of him stretched an infinity that did not care who he was. He moved forward anyway, not as a Morty defined by proximity to a Rick, not as a ruler or a revolutionary, but as a mind choosing its own trajectory. Escape velocity is not about speed. It is about breaking the pull of something that insists you belong to it. The Morty who did not belong achieved that quietly, without celebration, without witnesses who truly understood what had changed. And as he disappeared into the wider multiverse, the space he left behind closed, leaving only debris, memory, and the echo of a structure that had tried to make infinity manageable. The Citadel was gone, the curve was broken, and the multiverse, vast and indifferent, resumed its endless unfolding, no longer shaped around a single kind of mind.